What's up, YouTube? So today I'm going to be providing everyone here a comprehensive guide on what to look for when buying a Mercedes 240D. And if you're new to these cars entirely, this guide is for you. And even if you're a seasoned veteran that has owned several of these, it's good to kind of run through these things and get a refresher on these items. Now, if I leave anything out, feel free to leave a comment below and let me know, and I can definitely add that to the next video perhaps. But without further ado, we're going to go ahead and jump right into this video. Is this car for you? When purchasing a 240D, the best advice that I can give anyone is buy the best example you can afford. So in my situation, I bought one that was a little bit more on the budget side, and because of that, I did have to put more work into it. But overall, try to find the nice example that you can. Lower mileage isn't always better, but find something with good maintenance records, something that has an overall clean and polished kind of thing. Now, of course, if you're looking for something that's good mechanically and interior and body wise, you're gonna probably spend upwards of $5,000 to $10,000. Of course, that's a pretty big range, and I have seen a lot of these cars sell for around 15 to 20,000, and even up past that, depending on how low the mileage is. But again, buy the nicest example you can get. And if you're on a budget, that's okay too, but be prepared to do some maintenance and some fixes. Yearly maintenance isn't too expensive on these cars, especially if you DIY. And typically, you'll probably spend around $1,000 to $2,000 a year on the maintenance. With it being a 43-year-old car, in my example, things break due to age. They are built like tanks and will quote unquote last forever, but that comes with maintenance. You have to put the work in, and the car will definitely reward you. Now, my Mercedes 240D, I purchased in California and drove it back here, and of course, I always urge this, run the Carfax. The seller could say, hey, it is from California, but it might not be. In my situation, it lived in New York, but don't let that alarm you either because the undercoating on these cars are very stout. And if you buy one that's been taken care of, you will be able to tell that based on the inspection. So we're going to go into pros and cons here, starting out with a strong pro. They're fun to drive. Now they're really slow, which could also be a con, but overall I enjoy it. 0 to 60, that's funny. It takes maybe 20 to 30 seconds if you're flooring it, but if you're just moseying around town or you're not in a hurry or you live in an area that's not really traffic inflated, then the 240D is a good car, and they're really well built for city driving. Now, they will do highway driving. They get a little loud, the engine revs up, but in my honest opinion, that's probably good because carbon buildup is no joke. So getting those revs up is pretty crucial to making sure your 240D runs really well. But yeah, they're slow. They're easy to work on for the most part. They're DIY friendly. A lot of the components are easy. Oil changes, really straightforward. Now, due to age, don't blame the car for this one, but due to age, sometimes these old bolts and nuts, even if they're not rusted, they will break. So, my best advice there is to get a torque wrench or a torque meter of some sort to make sure you're not over tightening everything because drilling out bolts that are seized or you know, extracting those bolts can be very tedious and things can go south really quickly. And that's also why I recommend always having a indie shop on speed dial, so to speak, in case something does go wrong in your DIY process. And also understanding where your knowledge is and where your mechanical experience lies. If you feel the job is going to be a little bit too hard for you based on the procedure, then sometimes it's better just to have the shop do the repairs. As far as maintenance goes, once you get that caught up, the reliability, they're pretty good. They're pretty good. Again, 43, 45, 40, 38-year-old car, they're going to have some issues here and there, but it's up to you to know how all of the systems work in the car and understanding what has been done and what's original, because sometimes these original parts will go a really long time. And in my case, there are still a lot of original parts on the car that are just fine, but it's going to be up to you to do inspections. I always recommend a weekly inspection on engine components, looking around for rust. And of course, when you do your oil change, that's a great opportunity to get under the car and inspect for leaks and things like that, which later on in the video, I'll go over some common oil leaks and things like that, along with providing some pictures and photos of these examples that I'm drawing from. Now to the cons. There are a couple of these. If you don't have any mechanical knowledge, don't know how to even hold the wrench, I probably would not advise buying one unless you have a deep pocket and money is no object. If you're the type that has plenty of money and have a good indie shop, then it could still work for you. But even at that point, you're going to want to be able to know at least what the components are and how the car works so you can understand and know when things need to be replaced. Now, if it's a weekend driver, obviously these things are not going to really apply as much, but if you're like me and you daily drive this car every day and take it out of town, it's going to be really critical to understand how everything works in the car and most importantly, staying up on the maintenance. Now, these cars will run forever. However, asterisk, if the maintenance is done, stay on top of that. It's really important. Another con is sometimes the parts are really hard to find. So you're going to be hunting, searching, trying to find the part number sometimes can be difficult. The Mercedes dealer might not have it, but later on in the video, I'm going to kind of go over some sources on where you can buy parts, both new, used, and know where to source those. All right, so the first step when you're looking at a 240D to purchase is to inspect for rust. This is the number one killer to these old Mercedes. And the very first place that a lot of people might not check is the battery tray and under the battery tray. What happens is the drains for the water in the fenders and associated areas, they will clog up and rain and water will get all up in there. And over time, it will cause the paint to come out and will give you a serious rust problem. And while a lot of it's superficial, you can fix it, use fiberglass, and use a material called Miracle Paint to correct it once it's sanded. There are some issues where if it gets bad enough, the sway bar mounting points will fall off or break, and that will be a safety concern and will almost total the car out unless you are ready to spend some big bucks on some rust repair. But the most important thing is just to stay on top of it and inspect the battery tray. Step one, if the whole thing is there, that's a good sign, because usually I see on some cars the tray is just completely rusted out. So obviously when you're buying these cars or when you're looking at them, you're not going to be able to probably take the battery out. It's kind of a chore. They tuck it in there pretty good, but if you can kind of get your phone in and kind of push it down, take a video, pull it up, and then just kind of check, make sure there's no major holes, then you'll be able to check that way without having to remove the battery. Rocker panels, you want to check the rocker panels, make sure there's no rust. And even if it was a salt-free car for its entire life, check those corners. And right over here, I'm going to show you a clip of the rust that's developing on my rocker corner, and I'm having that addressed in a month or so. It's pretty urgent. The cars will rust there, even if it's in a clean environment. And yeah, so you'll check there, check your rocker panels, look under the door seals. That's another common place that they'll rust. Other than that, general advice on any car, in fact, is just look underneath, check the underbody, make sure there's no major rust, make sure the connections to all the components of the suspension and steering isn't rusting out. And as long as there's no major rust, that's fine. And if there is a little bit of rust and that's your vibe, then go for it. All things are fixable with a little money or time or both, usually both. But yeah, just check for rust. That's seriously the number one killer on these old Mercedes. The windshield seal around the front and back windshields oftentimes will go bad, and over time, water will start to get in there and cause rust. In my example, my windshield seal was just starting to leak and was dripping water in my foot. And that causes an array of problems. You'll get water in the cabin, and then you'll start noticing that you're getting water on your foot. All of that water soaking into the floor, which over time can rust the floor pans. So it's really important to make sure that gasket has either been replaced, check for obvious damage, do a water test, and a lot of shops can actually use specialty silicone to go underneath the seal to repair the existing one if it's not too bad. So we're going to jump into the next topic here, and that's the engine itself. These old 240Ds have the OM616, and some of this advice also applies to the OM617, which is found in the 300D. When you first buy the car, obviously bringing a compression tester and doing all that is a little extra. So there's a couple things you can check to kind of ballpark it more or less to see if it does have good compression. Ideally, when you first go to look at it, try to get the seller to not have it warmed up at all, preferably a cold start. And once you turn the ignition on and let the glow plugs go for a bit, it should fire right up. If it's got a long crank or if it starts up and it's real shaky and the engine mounts are good, then it's a possibility that the compression is low on one or more of the cylinders and you will never get rid of that shake. It's a crazy thing. There are other things that can cause an engine shake in these cars, but compression can be a large contributing factor to that engine shake. Another kind of quick test to see if the compression's good is when you got the car running, shut it off. If it just kind of is just like a quick shut off, then that's good. But if it kind of like stumbles and just has a hard time with shutting down, that could also be an indication of low compression. Now, of course, that's not always the case, but it's a good kind of like ballpark figure on is the engine healthy. Once you have your compression verified or more or less, have the understanding that the engine does have good compression. Oil consumption is a largely debated topic. I've seen some cars that burn way more than that, and that is not good. But on mine, for example, it burns a quart every 2,000 miles, and typically that's within range. That is within range. And just keep in mind that the cars will burn a little oil, and when you do the oil change, don't fill it up all the way to the top of the full mark. A lot of people suggest going halfway on the stick, and it will burn less. Another note is if you do a lot of highway driving, you're probably going to burn a little bit more oil, and that is somewhat normal. City driving seems to burn less oil. It could be depending on the engine, of course, but a little oil burning is going to be expected, so it's going to be up to you to check the oil and make sure that it is at the proper level. As far as oil recommendations are concerned, I always suggest Dyno oil, Rotella 15W40. I think it's T4, I want to say. I'll put a picture of it here. I recommend running that. Change it every 3,000 miles. If you do a lot of stop and go traffic, short trips, things like that, of course, that interval could be anywhere between 25 to 3,000 miles. Now, if you want to run synthetic, be my guest. Not a bad idea, but in a lot of ways, it's overkill because when these cars were manufactured, the oil specs were much different than today, and the oil on the market today, even just the Dyna oil, has a lot better quality than it did back in the day. So just keep that in mind. You don't gotta get really expensive oil, especially if your car burns oil. Stick with something, inexpensive. Rotella is just an all-around great oil for these cars. Dello is another option that I recommend. And I will link a video to another YouTuber that actually has a really good video on how to do the oil change. I'll kind of go over all that stuff. So I'll put that below so you can investigate that. A common overlooked item on these cars as well is the oil filter housing stems. There's two on the stem. I'll put a picture up there. And over time, these O-rings get brittle and they get flat. And basically what that does is it allows the oil to drain out overnight. So when you cold start your Mercedes, it takes a second to build that pressure up. And over time, that could cause some serious damage. And it's not really hard to do. It's really easy. Just have a pick tool or a flathead, prime off, and then slide them up the stem. And I recommend doing that every 2 or 3 oil changes. If those O-rings are in really good shape, then your oil filter housing will hold oil, and your pressure will also be more solidified. It'll be smooth. And I've noticed that my gauge doesn't shake like it did before. When I was driving it home at idle, it would kind of flutter a little bit. But ever since I replaced those stems, that really it corrected that issue. When you first start the car, it's going to peg the 3 until it's warmed up. And once it's warmed up, you want to sit between 1.5 and 2.5. So that's kind of where you want to be. If it's idling and it's at like 1 or anywhere below that, I would be concerned because that would be an indication that there is oil pressure issues on the Mercedes that you're looking at or the one that you currently own. As far as checking for blow by, that's something you can do by loosening the cap and seeing how much it dances. If it blows off the valve cover, then that's a good indication that the engine's tired. But if it's dancing a little bit, if it's got a little shake to it, not the end of the world. But that's one way you can kind of check for blow by. It's not always an indication that you have excessive blow by, but it's one check that you can do for peace of mind. Another common thing to look at for these cars are the engine and transmission mounts. Those take a lot of vibration, and it's imperative to have good mounts. And over time, if your mounts are bad, it can cause wear on the rest of the drivetrains. In my case, they were original, so I had those replaced. It's also important to buy a good brand. Don't get the cheapest one you can get. Try to get like a mid-tier if you're on a budget. As long as you get a good set of mounts, you'll be set. And from what I researched briefly, I think you can technically use the 300D mounts. They're a little bit stronger since that's a 5-cylinder turbo. But honestly, I would purchase the ones that are for the car and go with that. Now, the transmission mount is one that's very much overlooked. People always look at the engine mounts. The transmission mount is the one that you want to also check because if it's sagging, it can cause excessive driveline wear, which over time, again, can wear out those driveline components. In regards to the drivetrain, something you want to check for is torn CV boots on the axles. And once those tear, it'll actually leak oil. I didn't have grease for that at that point, so those will rip and this oil will go everywhere. And over time, they'll start to click and cause grinding problems and reliability issues. So make sure those boots are good. If they're not, you could reboot it, but the aftermarkets are nice because once you replace them, instead of having to open the differential every time, they are external. So you just unbolt and you don't have to deal with all that. In regards to the throttle linkage system on these cars, you want to check and make sure everything's nice and tight. And in a lot of cases, the bushings are going to be broken. It's going to be metal metal contact. And at that point, you can try to source replacements, but they're very hard to get. So in a lot of ways, you kind of have to fabricate your own. You can get used ones, but they'll probably do the same thing. But I'll show you a picture here. I used some rubber hoses to kind of modify it to where it was nice and snug. And then there's also the main linkage bushing, which you can get replacements for on the websites that I'll mention here in a little bit. This is another important thing on these old Mercedes that you want to stay on top of. Bad injectors with terrible spray patterns is a slow killer to these engines. And over time, it will exhibit bad spray patterns. Of course, you don't have to replace these like every 50,000 miles or anything excessive, but you want to make sure that the injectors are in good shape. Most of the time, the cars that you're going to be looking at will need injectors. There's multiple options available. I use the Bosch Made in India injectors, which some guys and gals say, woohoo, that's junk. But honestly, they aren't terrible. They're a good price. I paid what, 40 bucks an injector, plus I had a shop install them. They've been pretty good. I've put about 3,000 miles since that install, and they have been really solid. There's another website I'm going to go ahead and give you a link to that I've heard really great things about. It's W123garage.com. They actually refurbish your old nozzles And from what I gather, they do a really good job and they're pretty responsive. You can either send in your old ones and they refurbish those, or you can purchase them and then send your old ones back for a core. So making sure that you have good injectors is very critical. A symptom of bad fuel injectors, once you kind of know the compression's good, it's going to have a shaky idle, it's going to make a bunch of noise, and that's a good indication that you will need to replace those. Typically, these cars will get anywhere from 20 to 23, maybe 24 city, and highway, you're probably looking at anywhere between 26 and 32 miles per gallon. So if those numbers are way off, that could also be an indication that the injectors are worn, because over time, if the spray pattern's terrible, it's going to wash the cylinder walls, and that's just going to cause damage long term. Good glow plugs is very important, especially for cold starting and especially in the cold. You want to make sure those glow plugs are working fine and dandy. Another thing to check on these cars is the injection pump timing. There are a couple methods you can do, and Mercedes Source has a little tool that allows you to check using what they call the drip method. And basically, you screw this little tool in, and it's going to do 1 drip per second, and that's how you know your injection pump is good on timing. Additionally, you want to check for smoke. A little smoke on startup's okay. They're diesels. It's supposed to do that. But if the car is warmed up and it's still smoking, and that's a good indication there's a problem. So, something to know. Inspect the fuel filters. You want the spin-on and the inline filter to be up in current. In my situation, the inline filter was black. Replacing those yearly, every other year is fine, just depends on your application. And a lot of times these old Mercedes, they will develop a algae problem. It'll grow in the tank if you don't drive it enough or anything like that. And a lot of times that will manifest with getting algae in the fuel system altogether, and it's just going to clog stuff up. The algae will typically show up in those filters and will probably prematurely clog them up. So if you're having to replace your fuel filters quite often, that could be an indication that there is a buildup of algae in a tank, and there are methods to remove that, which all over the internet you can search for, but there are ways to get rid of that using specialty chemicals. Valve adjustments. This is super critical as well. And again, these cars will run forever, but you want to make sure the valves are adjusted. Mercedes recommends every 12,000 miles. And in my honest opinion, as long as you check them every 12,000 miles, you should be good. And if they are within spec every time you check them, just leave them. Don't worry about it. But, if they're a little bit out of adjustment, do it. I think they should revise that. It should be checked every 12,000 miles. And that kind of ties into a point that I'll talk about later where there's a common oil leak that the valve cover leaks. So this is a good opportunity just to replace it. The part's cheap. You got to take the valve cover off anyway. So anytime you are doing the valve adjustment or having a shop do it, just do the valve cover gasket. You're already there. Might as well do it. The transmission, this is a hot topic as well because fluids, just everyone loves to have their opinion on it, but long story short, the Mercedes calls for an old ATF that's a GM based fluid that is no longer available. And long story short, it's just ATF. And the most inexpensive compatible fluid to use on these transmissions for the 4 speeds is just regular old non-synthetic Dexmerk. You can use synthetic, but the non-synthetic is fine. There is an ATF that Liqui Moly sells, I think, or it might be Febi. I'll double check that here in a minute, but you can use that. Or some people have used gear oil, but I don't know. I feel kind of weird using that stuff because the car calls for ATF. You should stick to what the car calls for unless there's like a technical service bulletin, which I don't believe there has been one. But just making sure that fluid's good, clean, change it every now and then. You should be good. Coolants. Check your coolant levels. And as far as what coolant to use, I recommend the Xerox G48 Blue. Now, when you use the G48 Blue, you want to make sure the entire system's flushed out. And the reason why I went with G48 was because the blue coolant is more accessible. I'm not saying that you will always have to top off your fluids, but I'd rather be stranded somewhere with a more accessible coolant option. A lot of the guys and gals on the forums recommend Xerox GL5, which is mostly compatible with a lot of stuff, so it makes sense. And I don't know of any other fluid I would recommend. Universal coolant usually isn't a good option unless you have to. It's an emergency, but you can use that. But typically, to summarize, G48 blue or GO5, which is like kind of like a goldish yellow color, I would recommend doing that. Changing the coolant out every 3 years is going to be a good number to shoot for because over time the coolant does break down, it becomes acidic, it starts eating the internal components and the gaskets and can cause some serious problems, especially in diesel engines. As far as the brake and the clutch system, they share the reservoir with the master cylinder. You've got the slave cylinder and clutch master cylinder as well. And something that you want to keep up with is fluid changes. I recommend changing that every 3 years. If you drive a lot of miles, change it more often. But there are also testers you can get, dip it in there. I don't know how accurate those are, but rule of thumb, just change it every 3 years. And as far as the clutch hydraulics, if you're noticing that you're losing fluid, a great way to figure out where it's coming from is if you see brake fluid coming out of the bell housing, it will be clear. And of course, diesel oil is black. And even when you change the oil and start it up, it just turns black. So if you notice that you're having like a yellowish oil coming from your bell housing, it's probably your slave cylinder. And with that being said, if the slave cylinder is going out, go ahead and replace the clutch master cylinder because the chances are that's going to go out soon too. So go and get those both replaced and life is good. As far as like what type of fluid to use, dot 4. That's it. Nothing fancy. I think it's all synthetic, but O'Reilly, Walmart, you can use SuperTech, as long as you change it every 3 years, that's what's more important. Steering and components when you're test driving a car, it's going to have a little bit of play. That's by design. But if it's really sloppy, you want to inspect everything. The tie rods are usually a pretty big culprit of that. Tie rods, ball joints, the upper control arms and upper ball joints typically are original on a lot of these cars. So just keep an eye out on that. And yeah, you can adjust the steering box to make it tighter, but you got to be careful because if you go a little too tight on that, the steering wheel won't return to center and you'll actually do damage to your steering box. And additionally, check the fluid. It uses ATF. A lot of people recommend using a updated power steering fluid, and it's really simple. There's a procedure. You just, suck it out, change the filter, add new fluid, lock it both sides a couple times, suck it out, and just repeat the process until the fluid is nice and clean. I recommend doing that every 2 or 3 years, just, kind of whatever you see fit. Just keep an eye on what that fluid looks like, and most importantly, just keeping it clean. The air filter, inspect your air filter, make sure it doesn't have a bunch of oil in it. And they're pretty easy to source. You can get it at pretty much any O'Reilly, order online. Now, if your car is a California emissions vehicle, you're probably going to have to order it online because it uses a little bit different of a filter. But overall, sourcing a filter isn't a big deal. Those are recommended to be changed every 15,000 miles. Also, while we're talking about the airbox, something you'll want to check is the air filter mounts. Those constantly break because of all the excessive vibration. And if those are broken for a very long time, technically unmetered air could get into the system, dirt and debris and all that stuff, and will cause damage to your cylinders. So it's really important to make sure those are good. Make sure they're solid. If they're broken, replace them. No questions asked because it's going to make a horrendous rattling noise and it's just not a good time for anybody. Additionally, if you do any front end work on your Mercedes or have any front end work done, get in alignment. Absolutely get in alignment. No questions. Just do it. All right, so three of the common oil leaks on these cars is going to be your valve cover gasket, which if you replace that while you're doing your valve adjustment, you're going to avoid that one. The oil pan gasket will leak. If it's seeping, leave it alone. Don't worry about it. Just keep an eye on it. But if it's physically dripping oil on the ground, that's a good time to replace that. And the other common place where these like to leak oil is, oddly enough, inside the cluster. I had this happen to me, and a friend of mine was able to refurbish the original one with a soldering iron. This is not available to purchase new, so a lot of these gauges will be used and may or may not exhibit those same problems, but it's a pretty straightforward process. And you could also install an aftermarket gauge. I'm going to go ahead and put the picture from the website from, I think it's Ben's Force. From Ben's Force up here, if you want to, add an aftermarket, it converts the fitting to an NPT. And I'm not going to go into the details with that, but I tried to go aftermarket, and it's kind of a pain on these cars because the fittings on the pressure line are a little funky. So with that being said, that's a common place for the oil to leak, and it will drip on your foot, and it's just not a good time. One last thing that I did want to mention before we go into the next segment of this video is to inspect your oil cooler lines and inspect them regularly, especially if you are on the originals. If they're not leaking, that's okay. But long story short, once they start to leak, it can get pretty dramatic after that. And if you're on the highway or just driving and all of a sudden those lines explode, your oil pressure will drop dramatically. And if you don't shut that car off in time, your engine is going to be destroyed. And these engines are pretty expensive to rebuild and even source use. So be sure to inspect the oil cooler lines on the Mercedes that you're looking at, or if you already own one, make it as part of the things that you inspect on your weekly or monthly basis or whatever. A couple of other small issues to look for is the doors. Sometimes they don't shut like a Mercedes should shut. And a lot of times these pieces here, I'll put a link up here, a picture rather, and these just need either adjusted or the pieces on the door need to be replaced. Sometimes those need service, but that's pretty common on these. The EGR valves are notorious for clogging up and doing all that stuff. So it's really important to make sure that your EGR valve is clean. The EGR valve also helps with warm-up times in the winter, so it's a really good idea to keep those on the car. Vacuum leaks. Vacuum leaks are very common. Sometimes you try to shut the car off, it won't shut off. You have to manually do it underneath the hood. Sometimes the door locks don't work. Sometimes you just have all kinds of weird issues. So just be aware that there are vacuum leaks that may or may not need to be addressed. Now, on the manual cars, you don't have to worry about that so much because the automatic trans relies heavily on vacuum and the manual trans has no vacuum. So you can kind of get away with issues. Try to opt for a manual so that way you can at least drive the car with vacuum leaks if you have to. The automatic transmissions don't like it at all. A couple of general tips when driving the car on the cluster, there are dots like 2, 3, and 4. Those are not the shift points. Those are maximum speeds per gear. And you can rev it up all the way to that if you want to get maximum acceleration, but you don't have to. You know, first to second, I go to 20, 20 to 30, maybe 35, I could put it in third, 35 to 45. At that 45 point, I put it in fourth if I don't need to climb. And from there, all's good. So just keep in mind that those dots on the cluster are indications of maximum speed, not the actual shift points in the manual transmission. Additionally, it's common knowledge that diesels don't like short trips. So if you only drive 1 or 2 miles, it's not going to hurt it per se, but getting it on the highway once a week or so, getting it up to operating temperature, that really helps with the carbon buildup and all that stuff. And most importantly, the oil change intervals, making sure that you are on time with that. Use good diesel. Truck stops are the best places because they're constantly replenishing their stock and inventory. So that works. Of course, any gas station with diesel, it's okay. But if you can go for a truck stop, I would do that. So for the last segment of this video, I'm going to share with you a lot of places, or a lot of great places where you can purchase parts for your Mercedes. Now, the top of my list is FCP Euro. They have a lifetime warranty and they carry quite a good amount of selection. And they actually have a customer service number you can call to verify the part fitments, because there are some models of the 240Ds that the VIN numbers are in a range where the part won't work. So it's really important and imperative to make sure the part that you order is compatible with your Mercedes. You can go to Pelican Parts and purchase some OEM options like radiator hoses, radiator caps, water pumps like that if you want to go with genuine Mercedes. But they also offer a pretty big selection of aftermarket parts. And yeah, the only downfall to the website or to that service is the shipping is a little bit slow. So I typically recommend using them if you're not in a big hurry, or if you are able to get that OEM option and you're willing to wait, and that's totally fine. And they also offer a lifetime warranty on their parts as well. So highly recommended as between those two if you're looking for new aftermarket parts or if you're looking for Mercedes genuine parts. For used components like specific trim pieces or unobtainium pieces of the car, eBay is a pretty good place. They've got a money back guarantee. You're pretty much good to go there. Lots of options as well. Sometimes they have new old stock, which is pretty cool, but generally speaking, for items like clusters, oil pressure gauges, hard to find parts, eBay is a pretty good source. The junkyards these days don't really have these cars, so that's kind of where you're limited to. Another great place to get OEM parts is the Mercedes Classic Parts Center. You can get some parts to them, but typically they're going to be expensive. Mercedes Source, they have a lot of good tools, custom tools. There's a valve adjustment tool that makes the job a lot easier. They have removal tools for various components that are really good. And a lot of times they include free videos, and that's really helpful, especially if you plan on doing DIY type things. And they also offer some hard to find parts. The oil filter stem O-rings, that's where I sourced mine. They're a little bit pricier, but they're good. They also carry the Miracle paint that I mentioned earlier. That is also a really good product for rust repair. Of course, you're taking this to an Indy or whatever and getting it repaired to them. There's no point of really ordering from them. But yeah, with that being said, great source for videos that are probably a little bit better than YouTube, depending on the category, and amazing tools. So that concludes today's video. Be sure to like and subscribe below, and I'll be posting more videos. I plan on doing like a couple of DIY videos, such as adjusting the idle. This will apply to the 616 and 617. But yeah, I mean, these cars are cool. They're reliable. And as long as you stay up on the maintenance and buy a good car out the gate, you'll be all right. Thanks for watching, and I will see you on the next video.